Ashutosh, everyone well at the department?
Yeah, so a lot of us have had COVID.
Oh,
I think me and Sehjal are left out. Navneet is left out, but Ritesh, Prasad, Valiappan, all three were down. Baburam is currently recovering from COVID. And, we have had our share.
okay.
Two of our senior residents have recovered.
All mild
So,
COVID, hopefully.
yeah, everyone has had mild COVID. So that's a good thing. But
Are you seeing anyone who's post-vaccination having bad COVID? We've seen a couple of patients after the first dose, not anyone after the second dose.
So Ritesh and Prasad both got it immediately after the first dose, day 3 or day 4. Fortunately, they were quite sick. I mean, with high fever and severe body aches and so on, but no hypoxia, fortunately.
This was after
There
the
are, of
vaccine?
course, a lot of patients.
No, Ashok, this was after the vaccine or before the vaccine?
This is after the vaccine. So they must have been incubating the virus when they got the vaccine, most likely.
So even a single shot vaccine, no, if there's some time duration, 2-3 weeks is helpful. I've seen that. Even if you suppose and you get COVID after 2-3 weeks after that, you are getting an immunity.
Yeah, plus we don't know what the how good the vaccine is. The trial data is quite different from real world data.
I was data from Seychelles actually, so there was,
Now they're extending the duration between the two shots.
Yeah, they have increased the duration, 12 weeks now, minimum. You won't even get an appointment before that.
Like you said, data keeps emerging.
No, I think our stocks keep going down. That is why the the whole thing is happening. It was the same in UK.
Still the same, but for transplant patients, they're thinking about giving booster doses. Probably they'll get 3 doses. And for general population, they're still keeping it as 2 doses, 12 weeks apart.
Yeah,
and
but
AstraZeneca for under 40s.
yeah, but for I think the elderly, they have reduced it to 8 weeks. I read that in the paper. UK has reduced the duration from 12 to 8 weeks for people above 50 years or something like that.
Yeah.
Dr. Rupam, please come on. We'll just start now. So, friends, today's webinar is the webinar number 13, a series of Sunday webinars for all our intensivists and allied specialties. There will be 2 speakers today. One will be Dr. Rupam Sehjal, who has kindly consented for the webinar. She has a small daughter. She is consented to take this. We are thankful to her. Please mute yourself. Everybody else, just kind of mute yourself. Please mute yourself, everybody, for the time being. Only the panelists put on their speaker, please. There's a lot of disturbance.
और मम्मी का क्या बताया तूने? मम्मी ठीक है जी, एक वो छोटी सी गोली ले लेती हूँ रात को। हाँ।
खन्ना, please mute yourself, sir. खन्ना sir.
बंद कर दो, बता दिया मैंने छोटे को। मम्मी की दवाई और बता दो जी इनको बार-बार में, है कौन? Okay.
So today's webinar is on lung transplant, a field which is relatively unexplored and not really progressing in India. And we will hear about lung transplantation, the way it is, from Dr. Rupam Sehjal, who is working in one of the great centers in UK, which is the Harefield Hospital, which specializes in cardiac as well as lung transplant. So she has a lot of hands-on experience being right there. And then we'll have the Indian perspective, because she is from UK. They have a different scenario there. What challenges we are facing in India, why it is not progressing so well in India, from Dr. Srinivas Rajagopalan, who himself has done a fellowship from Ontario which runs one of the world's best transplant programs. And on the panel, we have Dr. Ashutosh Nath Agarwal. Sir is head of Department of Pulmonology at PGI Chandigarh, and we were fortunate to work together and undergraduates at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And even they had done a lung transplant some time back, but their program is also not taken off. So the first speaker will be Dr. Rupam, and we'll take some questions if there are any, and whatever the comments are there. And then we'll have Dr. Srinivas telling us about the Indian perspective. So over to you, ma'am, Dr. Rupam.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to Dr. Tapesh Bansal for giving me this opportunity to participate in this teaching session. It's an honor for me. And my regards to Dr. Rajgopal and Dr. Agarwal. They are very senior professors and physicians, and I'm obliged to be part of this group today to present my teaching. And my topic, and I'll be talking about lung transplantation, the intensive care part. Before beginning, I just want to convey to everybody and hope everybody is doing well. Their families are doing all right with the second wave of COVID raging in India. And please keep safe and hope things are all right. So let's start lung transplantation and intensive care perspective. My name is Rupam. I am a senior clinical fellow at Royal Brompton and Harefield in London. This is my hospital where I work. It's the Harefield branch of the trust. In 1980, under the leadership of Mr. Mahdi Yaqub, the surgeons had performed Harefield's first heart transplant. In 1983, Mr. Yaqub performed the first combined heart and lung transplant worldwide. In my presentation, first of all, I'll be giving a background about the lung transplantation, the trends over recent decades. I'll also have a case for discussion so that the practical points and the possible complications and management is easily discussed. I'll be touching upon indications and listing criteria, not for all the diseases, but the one pertaining to our case, and certain critical care issues. And I'll also talk about ECMO and COVID in lung transplantation, just highlighting a few points which are very practical. Looking at the slide, this is heart and lung transplant trend over last few decades. As we can see, the number of double lung transplants has increased exponentially over last few decades, and the single lung transplants have more or less remained the same. This could be possibly due to better outcomes with the bilateral and the double lung transplants. Looking at major diagnosis of adult lung transplants, green represents a COPD, red is a phenotype of emphysema with alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. CF, cystic fibrosis, is represented by the purple color, and idiopathic interstitial pneumonias are blue with non-IIP-ILDs yellow, pre-transplant. We can see a clear shift of trend here in early 90s till up to 2005. COPD was the most common indication for lung transplant, but after 2005, we can see slowly ILDs are becoming a more common diagnosis for transplant. This could partly be because of the introduction of lung allocation score in 2005, which preferred or prioritized patients with more progressive diseases, especially interstitial lung diseases. And that has led to a dramatic decrease in waiting list mortality and a shift in the type of patients who are taken up for lung transplant. Looking at the survival with respect to double lung transplant, survival post-transplant is around median survival is around 7.8 years, and with single lung transplant, it is around 4.8 years. Coming to our case history, I'll be discussing this very complex and interesting case that I had seen recently. It's a 41-year-old female. She had a diagnosis of COPD, also with hereditary uncharacterized bronchiectasis. She was started on long-term oxygen therapy in 2016 and was also on NIV in 2018. She had recurrent infections with Pseudomonas and an element of pulmonary hypertension. Pre-transplant, her lung function was 23% FEV1 and 64% FVC. This is her chest X-ray pre-transplant. We can see the hyperinflated lung fields with element of few cystic shadows here and there. So looking at this lady, so she was being evaluated and there were certain factors which were being considered that what could impact her outcome, especially infections in the past, the element of pulmonary hypertension. She was very breathless and did not have very good rehab potential and had poor exercise tolerance. She had undergone chronic steroid use. Also, she had issue of depression in the background. And at this point, I would like to talk about when to refer and when to list the patients for lung transplant. So timing of transplantation is when the likelihood of survival from transplant exceeds that without it. So for COPD, timing of referral. So the disease is progressive despite when the disease is progressive and on maximal treatment. We emphasize a lot on pulmonary rehabilitation and oxygen therapy. If the patients can undergo, they should go undergo endoscopic or surgical lung volume reduction surgeries, Bode index 5 to 6, PaCO2 more than 45, and FEV1 less than 25% predicted. So once they are referred, they are evaluated by the transplant center, and then when are they listed, when are they put on the waiting list? Any one criteria is sufficient. If the Bode index is more than 7, FEV1 is 15 to 20%. If they have had 3 or more severe exacerbations, or even one severe exacerbation that has led to an acute type 2 respiratory failure and moderate to severe pulmonary hypertension. This is the paper that very beautifully lists the referral and the listing criteria. It was difficult for me to go through all, but if somebody is interested, and I would recommend reading this paper for clarification. Just a word about contraindications for lung transplantation. If there is evidence of severe extrapulmonary disease, poor nutritional rehabilitation, recent or current malignancies, active hepatitis B and C, severe psychiatric illness, absence of a social support network, and if the patient has had repeated non-compliance with medical care in the past. Pleurodesis can complicate surgery, but is not absolute contraindication. With regard to the contraindication, there are a few gray areas. First is age more than 65 years is taken as a cutoff age because the number of comorbidities increase dramatically after that. And HIV infection, it is now becoming a controversial thing. It's a center-dependent decision. Why? Because with the advent of new medications, though HIV is treatable and the longevity is there, there is high risk of rejection and infective complications with these patients. With regard to CF patients, presence of Burkholderia infection, which should be completely eradicated prior to transplant because it can again complicate it post-transplant, and presence of patients being on ECMO. Coming back to our case scenario, so this lady after rehabilitation became fit for surgery and was taken up for bilateral sequential single lung transplantation via bilateral thoracosternotomy, which is a clamshell incision. Post-op, she was on VA ECMO and came to ITU with an open chest. In her case, the total ischemia time was around 434 minutes for her right lung and 539 for her left lung. Intraoperatively, after she was commenced on double lung ventilation, her lungs became very edematous with progressive difficulty in ventilation. And she also became very, very vasoplegic with very labile hemodynamic parameters. And that was the reason that she went on to VA ECMO and had to be brought into ITU with support of NORAD, ADR, vasopressin, and inhaled nitric oxide. She was also coagulopathic with raised INR and thrombocytopenia and required transfusion of blood products. This is her post-operative X-ray. We can see that there are bilateral lung infiltrates which have happened immediately post-operatively. So when we see this X-ray post-op and there is difficulty in ventilation, hemodynamic parameters are becoming difficult to manage. So what do we think at that point of time? So here I would like to discuss the differentials for respiratory failure post-transplant, also known as primary graft dysfunction. The first differential that comes in this is ischemia reperfusion lung injury. This can happen immediate post-transplantation, where there is excessive extravascular lung water that leads to flooding of the interstitial and the alveolar spaces, and that presents with bilateral infiltrates because of the endothelial and epithelial injuries because of increased vascular permeability. These days, to prevent this kind of ischemia reperfusion lung injury, ex vivo lung perfusion is becoming very common, where the lungs, after they are taken off from the donor, they are perfused with a lung protective solution, and leukodepletion is also used. Other thing that we need to think is donor lung pathology. It could be a neurogenic pulmonary edema, or it could also be any aspiration that has happened. Other things are left ventricular dysfunction. Think about acute rejection. Acute rejection usually presents in 5 to 7 days after transplantation, but still hyperacute rejection is common and should be thought about. Infections are a risk and should be a differential at every point a patient is deteriorating. We also need to think about some surgical complications like airway anastomosis problem, vascular anastomosis problem, severe pulmonary hypertension, and size mismatch, in which if a large lung is implanted into a patient with small chest wall cavity, it can lead to squishing of the bases and can lead to difficulty in ventilation. A few things more about primary graft dysfunction. It is a triad of worsening gas exchange, decreased lung compliance with alveolar interstitial infiltrates, which occur within 72 hours of transplantation. This is the grading of PGD, the primary graft dysfunction. It is divided into 4 grades, depending upon the chest X-ray appearance and the PF ratios. PF ratios are taken at time 0, 24 hours, 48, and 72 hours. And the PGD grading at 72 hours predicts the long-term outcome of the patient and the mortality rate. PGD, again, as we have said, requires exclusion of hyperacute rejection, any anatomical anastomotic obstruction, pulmonary edema, and pneumonias. As cold ischemia time plays an important role, so we have to limit it and extend the reperfusion time. Generally, the organs are stored at around 4 degrees Celsius, and ischemia time up to 8 hours is acceptable. Above 8 hours, there is high risk of PGD. In our case, the time was around 9 hours, and she was at high risk of PGD. Another thing that needs to be seen as an intensivist is while we are ventilating these patients, we should also take into account the donor weight to prevent the risk of barotrauma, not only recipient's weight. Again, size mismatch should always be kept in mind. Management of these patients, basically lung protective strategies, restrictive fluid strategy, inhaled nitric oxide, and early ECMO is important. Basic checks after surgery is endotracheal tube positioning. Usually these patients get a bronchoscopy intraoperatively after surgery or within first 24 hours. Chest X-ray is very important to rule out any collections, pneumothorax, positioning of lines, and kinking of the intercostal drains. Analgesia, MAP, and cardiac index targets should be matched, and also PF ratios, as we have discussed earlier. Ventilator settings, so these are very institution based and the guidelines are depending upon the institution in which the transplant is happening, but mostly mode of ventilation is a control mode. In our institute, we use pressure control mode ventilation. Tidal volume, again, it's very important to stress that it is based on donor predicted body weight, and lung protective strategy, we use tidal volume of 6 ml per kg. Airway pressure, a PEEP of 5 centimeter is preferred, but not too high PEEP is to be avoided. In case of single lung transplant, especially for patients who are COPD emphysema, we should avoid PEEP because it can lead to dynamic hyperinflation of the native lung that can push the mediastinum and can also decrease the venous return, causing hypotension and hemodynamic instability. FiO2, a post-operative FiO2 of 60 to 80 is desirable. PO2 of 60 to 80 is desirable, and FiO2 can be titrated accordingly. In hemodynamic management, we have to remember that the transplanted lungs are very susceptible to pulmonary edema because of lymphatic disruption, the surge response to allograft. So first 72 hours, the fluid, the volume use should be very, very cautious. Overuse of crystalloids should be avoided. Colloids, blood, and albumin should be used. MAP targets of 65 to 75 and cardiac index 2.2 to 2.5 should be targeted. And for monitoring pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, CVP has been used traditionally. Pulse pressure, stroke volume variations, and extravascular lung water index are the ways to monitor these patients. A word about immediate postoperative surgical concerns. Bronchial anastomosis problem. So we have to remember if the patient is deteriorating that there is not only medical issues, some surgical issues can also happen, like dehiscence, which is rare but can be very fatal. As we can see, air around the bronchi can occur. So early CT scan to see the parenchyma and the airway is important. Bronchial or tracheal stenosis, these are they happen a bit late, but still they are important complications. Some patients can have prolonged or large air leaks post-transplant. Mediastinitis, empyema, even fungal infections at anastomotic sites are important to remember as differentials. Pulmonary artery anastomotic problems. Pulmonary artery stricture is very common, and oxygenation problems sometimes in absence of radiographic abnormalities. So we have to do a CTPA to find out whether this issue is there or not. Pulmonary venous, so pulmonary veins are very susceptible to kinking and clot formation and can cause immediate and profound pulmonary edema. And usually they can be evaluated postoperatively with TOE. Pulmonary vein thrombosis is rare, usually is unilateral, but if the thrombosis happens bilaterally, it can present as bilateral infiltrates, hemodynamic instability. Diagnosis again is with TOE, and management would either depend upon anticoagulation or surgical. Diaphragmatic dysfunction can contribute to difficulties in ventilation, and the incidence is up to 30% in single lung transplant. But usually this is just a neuropraxia, and if the patients are supported, and they can have prolonged weaning, but if they're supported, they usually recover and can be off NIV or BiPAP post-transplant. It can take up to 12 months. Coming back to our lady, so she was not improving, the ventilation was continued, she was on ECMO. The shadows on her left side were becoming denser. This lady had to go back to the theater, and there was 1 liter blood clot in the left chest and 200 ml in right. A small continuous ooze was found from the aortic cannulation side, and 1 small bleeder was seen in the right pulmonary vein, and they were surgically managed. After this, the ECMO was converted to peripheral VV ECMO, and the chest was closed and she was brought back. So this is her chest X-ray immediately post-op on the same day, which has shown drastic improvement after removing the collected blood. Here I would like to talk about a bit about post-lung transplant physiology. We should understand that the lungs, they become denervated. The cough response becomes is almost lost below anastomosis. The bronchial artery circulation and lymphatics will take several weeks to regenerate. Regulation of breathing is not lost because it is through the chest wall efferents. The ABGs are usually normal unless the patient is having some hypoxic drive, can go into respiratory acidosis. They have normal response to exercise and normal bronchomotor tone. A word about inhaled nitric oxide. Inhaled nitric oxide, it works by replenishing cyclic GMP, reduces PA pressures and pulmonary vascular resistance, improves oxygenation, and decreases platelet aggregation. But still, randomized control trials are awaited to benchmark it as having any mortality benefit or whether it shortens the duration of ventilation. But it is definitely used as a salvage therapy post-lung transplant, especially with the primary graft dysfunction. In this image over here, this is the normal ventilation perfusion. The alveoli are clear. The normal ventilation perfusion is happening. When the alveoli are flooded, so there is a VQ mismatch. When inhaled nitric oxide is given, it causes vasodilatation, and only in the areas where the inhaled nitric oxide reaches, but not in the flooded areas. So it can improve oxygenation. Post-operative care, it's very important to highlight that once the patients are through, they need chest physiotherapy. As we have discussed, the cuff response goes away and transplanted lungs are denervated. Sometimes these patients might also require frequent bronchoscopic washings, and if there is any doubt, bronchoscopy should be performed. Adequate analgesia is also very important. These patients, they come out with 4 chest drains, 2 apical, 2 basal, and the pain in the scar can be a hindrance to good chest expansion and physiotherapy. Coming back to our lady, so she was suppose she was doing very well after surgery and she was improving, but on day 10 her CRP increased to more than 400 and there was worsening of oxygenation. A CT scan was repeated and this lady now had a very dense right-sided pneumonia. And at this point, just would like to talk about antibiotic prophylaxis. So the post-transplant antibiotics are usually based on if the donor or the recipient had any pre-existing infection. Usually, if we are transplanting CF patients, they have resistant Pseudomonas, MRSA infections. So the antibiotics usually target those. Nosocomial infections are also common, and local microbiological guidelines are what is followed to give antibiotic. Another thing that is important to notice the CMV EBV status. All the patients post-transplant receive prophylaxis. If there is a CMV EBV mismatch, it is treated with antivirals. We use valganciclovir over here. All the patients also receive PCP prophylaxis and in form of quatrimoxazole. Atypical infections, the cover is given with azithromycin, which also has some immunomodulatory effect. Fungal prophylaxis is given in form of inhaled antifungals and commonly used is aerosolized amphotericin B. If there is any positive fungal culture, it can be escalated to intravenous antifungals. A word about immunosuppression. Usually these patients, when they come out, they are given IV methylpred preoperative.
Ma'am, may I just interrupt? This inhaled amphotericin, what is your experience with it? And like, how do you use it? And it does not cause any bronchoconstriction and stuff like that?
It does. It has a very bitter taste as well. So the patients are usually given salbutamol. So they go on inhaled amphotericin even at home. So these patients are given instruction to take inhaled salbutamol prior to it. And some patients do not tolerate it at all and have to come off it. But usually we do not see major compliance issues or major bronchoconstriction or wheezing associated with it and have good results. Even if the patients are if they're off it normally, but if they have any gardening work going on, any exposure to soil at their homes, even at that time, they are prescribed these inhaled antifungals.
But this is a prophylactic dose, right? The one that you use?
Yes, it is a prophylactic. And if there is any fungal, then we use azoles. Of course, once the azoles come into picture, then there is talk of interaction between the immunosuppressants is there. So normally we give inhaled, and if galactomannan is positive or we see any mold during bronchoscopy and fungal cultures are positive, they are started on posaconazole or voriconazole. Moving forward, as I was talking about immunosuppression, so these patients are usually on 3 agents. Corticosteroids are the mainstay, along with calcineurin inhibitors. In our center, we use tacrolimus and sirolimus. Antimetabolites, azathioprine and mycophenolate. These are the main 3 immunosuppressants all the patients are on. It's important that immediate post-transplant, the immunosuppressant levels are checked regularly because they have very narrow therapeutic index. So tacrolimus is targeted at quite high level immediate post-transplant because to create the immunosuppression, the levels are usually between 8 to 13 depending upon the institute. Also a close monitoring of platelets, white cell count, neutrophils because of the bone marrow suppression side effects of mycophenolate. These medications can complicate the ITU stay of the patients because of their possibility of nephrotoxicity, and some of the patients do end up on renal replacement therapy, and the medications have to be tweaked a bit. Some of these medications can also have neurological side effects, as we'll see in coming slides. So Our Lady, who had such a complex post-operative period when well-developed pneumonia, she did very well with the IV antibiotics. She was also given antifungal cover in the form of IV caspofungin, though she did not have any galactomannan was negative. Bile did not grow any culture, but she improved with the broad spectrum antibiotics and antifungal cover, and was doing well. But still on day 30, she started becoming hypoxic, and the donor-specific antibodies came out to be positive, and a diagnosis of antibody-mediated rejection was made for her, and she was treated with IVIG. In the background, she was having AKI and was on RRT. She also had focal seizures with CT head normal, which was thought to be related to tacrolimus. So this lady continued her rehabilitation, and the weaning was really, really slow. And she also had ICU-acquired weakness and very, very low mood. She never had eye contact even after getting up. And that was a challenge for the team. And during this course, she developed poor absorption of immunosuppressants and had to be converted from oral tacrolimus to IV tacrolimus to maintain her immunosuppression. Yes, she did have difficult weaning, but at last she came out of the ITU, was shifted to ward on CPAP for rehabilitation. So she stayed on the ward for almost 1.5 months. Here comes the role of not only in ITU setup, of course, the physios are important, but once the patients are in the ward, they need constant input from physios, occupational therapies, speech and language therapist, psychologist input, and very important is palliative team input, who manage the pain bit in our center. And then after 3 months post-transplant, she was discharged without oxygen, taking her own medications, and continuing the rehab at home. So I would like to just show a timeline of pulmonary complications. Though this lady almost had everything, even now she is discharged, but she is very high risk for other complications, and her long-term survival with the transplant is questionable. First of all, in 0 to 1 weeks, immediate post-transplant, we should think about PGD, which we have discussed in quite a detail. Infections are common, pneumonias, fungal infections are common, so they need to be taken into account. Pleural effusions, hemothorax, they can happen immediate post-transplant. Acute rejection is not seen immediately, but within 5 to 7 days, if patient is not doing well, we should think about acute rejection, and donor-specific antibodies should be regularly checked for these patients. Pulmonary embolism stays a risk in the background for all the patients at any point in post-transplant. Few months down the line, there is possibility they can develop strictures, which can again lead to retention of secretions, and repeated bronchs are required to remove those secretions. And eventually some patients might require stenting with either absorbable or permanent stents. Other major complication that these patients have is bronchiolitis obliterans, which is usually a late complication, but is the one that actually gets decided if the patient is having all these recurrent infections. And we can talk about it at some other session. Just a word about non-pulmonary ICU issues which these patients can have. Especially acute abdominal complications are very common, ileus and colitis. These are usually seen in CF patients who can develop intestinal obstruction post-operatively, which can be difficult to manage because that will affect the graft function. Patients can be oxygen dependent, they cannot move, the physiotherapy sessions cannot be held, they cannot walk around. So this is one of the important complications, and if it leads to perforation, then definitely the ICU stay would be prolonged. Next is complications related to tacrolimus. Cyclosporin, as we have seen, nephrotoxicity, neurotoxicity in form of seizures, even PRES can happen. They can have hemolysis syndromes as well. MMF, azathioprine, can cause bone marrow suppression, even pancreatitis can happen. Steroids, of course, they have short-term complications in the form of blood sugar derangement, increased risk of infections, but long-term complication in the form of requirement for bone prophylaxis, even psychosis is an important complication of steroids. And very long-term, these patients can have post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders, especially with CMV-EBV mismatch patients. I would like to touch upon ECMO and lung transplant. There are two things that I felt would be nice to talk about. Is every ECMO patient for transplant? So we do get a lot of referrals from ITUs saying this patient has been on ECMO for 3 months. Will he be fit for transplant? So first thing, that the first hurdle or the first current guidelines which are happening is, once we get a lung transplant request for any ICU patient, we need to see whether these patients are already fully evaluated and whether they are already listed for transplant or not. And so it happens, if they are not already evaluated or listed, they cannot be a transplant candidate in today's current scenario. Of course, with COVID, some changes might occur to this particular guidance for short while, changing the guidance for patients who are not evaluated to be taken up for transplants. If they are, then we have to exclude that. How is their rehab potential, or whether the age group has changed, because as the age increases, the comorbidities increase. Raised BMI is associated with increased mortality. With COPD, we would like to give more time for the lungs to recover and probably come out of the type 2 respiratory failure, especially if the patients go into multi-organ failure, especially with renal failure associated. They are not considered to be lung transplant candidates. So I thought this was a good teaching slide, and it had multiple things that one should be aware of. Other thing was regarding bridging for ECMO. Is ECMO for every patient who might need a lung transplant? So specific contraindications for bridging to lung transplant is if there is any irreversible extrapulmonary organ failure, if the patient is in septic shock, severe arterial occlusive diseases. Again, age becomes a relative contraindication depending upon the institute's experience as well. And if they had a poor pre-ECMO functional status with limited rehab potential, this is a very, very important point with regard to lung transplantation. Again, obesity, if BMI is more than 30, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia would complicate, and prior prolonged mechanical ventilation. Just a word about COVID. COVID is now becoming one of the common things that people are talking with regard to lung transplantation. A recent paper published has given data about 12 patients who were transplanted. So proposed criteria is, generally we would want the patient to be younger, around 65 years. Again, single organ failure. If they are multi-organ failures, few case reports are coming with the transplantation of lung and kidney as well, but it preferably single organ failure, no malignancy or disabling comorbidities, no dependence on alcohol or other drugs, should not be an active smoker. Of course, the body mass index should be in good range, and social support and insurance and financial support is important. Neurocognition, with regard to neurocognition, it is desirable that the patient should be awake, alert, participating in the talks about transplant, because transplanting a patient who was sedated, paralyzed, and he wakes up, it can be a big psychological trauma. Second thing about neurocognition is that if the patient cannot be awakened from the sedation, at least there should be evidence that there is no irreversible damage to the brain. General condition, again, we get referrals for patients who are on ECMO, who are walking around, are doing physio and are rehabilitating themselves, preparing themselves for transplant. So at least the general condition pre-COVID should have been active, healthy, and with good rehab potential. With regard to COVID-19 infection, if the patient is intubated, there should be 2 samples 24 hours apart from bronchoalveolar lavage, which should be negative. And if they are not intubated, then at least 2 samples from nasopharyngeal should be negative. Second thing is documentation or giving enough time for making sure that the patient have irreversible damage. The discussions that we usually have is that we don't know how the COVID-19's natural history is, and we would like to give sufficient time for the lungs to recover from this infection while on ECMO, or even if they are on long-term oxygen therapy, because all in long term, if they recover on their own native lungs would be more beneficial and will last longer than post-transplant, seeing all the complications that we expect to happen post-transplant. So giving them enough time, at least 4 to 6 weeks, to see whether this damage is reversible. If at any stage there is possibility of weaning of these patients from ECMO, or there is any signs of reversibility, there should be no rush for transplantation. So my take-home message is basically post-transplantation, lung protective ventilation and early extubation are very, very crucial to success. PGD and prolonged ventilation are associated with increased mortality. Multidisciplinary team input at every stage, pre-transplant, post-transplant, is very, very crucial. And also, of course, lung transplant is an potential option, but there should be no rush to transplant lungs while lungs need time to recover. And careful patient selection, good surgical technique, medical and intensive care is very crucial. All in all, in the end, we have to remember the human cost of all this that we are doing, and also rationalizing the scarce resources that all of us have. Thank you very much. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rupam Sejwal, ma'am. That was very nicely covered, giving an overview of lung transplant. Any comments, Dr. Ashutosh and Srinivasa? Dr. Ashu?
Yeah, no comments. I think practically all
Just put your video on,
things
sir.
were. Okay, so no major comments. I think one of the things that I just wanted to highlight was that in the immediate post-transplant scenario, I think you mentioned that colloids would be the fluid of choice. I think that there is a lot of controversy there because the lungs are also supposed to be leaky, and therefore some colloids, excess colloid use may also be detrimental. So I think a lot of centers also preferentially use only crystalloids, and colloids. I mean, I know it's a debatable thing, but I think that it may not be entirely correct to say that only colloids are the fluid of choice. So it has to be a balance. I think some centers from where I had some interaction, they said that they primarily use crystalloids and limit colloids if the fluid requirement is greater, or if they might use some small amount of albumin as a adjunct to crystalloids. So
I totally agree. That's what we need to have, a conservative approach, and if it is required, we should shift towards colloids rather than overzealous use of crystalloids. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashutosh.
I think the albumin might help if you use it along with this to kind of remove the fluid. You know, that has been kind of advocated. But I agree, crystalloids would be the preferred choice. But albumin may be used along with Lasix to remove the fluids. That has been kind of evidence-based. And ma'am, the other thing is, what kind of fluid monitoring device you use for giving fluids? Are you using PICO or something else?
Mostly over here, they use pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, and PICO is also used.
Srinivas, any comments, sir?
Oh yeah, so I first of all, congrats Dr. Rupam for a fantastic talk. It's kind of a summary, but I also must add that while it was an extremely challenging case that he chose to present. I don't want to the audience to take away an idea that this is how most transplants will be. This is not
Yeah,
how
that's
transplants will be.
true. I should have said that. Yes.
So it is a fantastic case to learn from. I would say 95% of transplants would be easier to manage than this.
Yes.
Second thing I wanted to say is I do not want to get into the fluid debate. We'll be debating it all day. So end of story for that. In terms of what you covered everything essentially, I just wanted to see that we see atrial fibrillation a lot very often. In fact, that's the most common complication I would say post lung transplant. Atrial arrhythmias are pretty common. Specific point in relation to lung transplant is we avoid amiodarone as much as possible, like the plague here. We generally try to use beta blocker and digoxin as much as possible. A lot of the atrial fibrillations are transient and are pretty transient, but some of them can quite persist, requiring long-term anticoagulation. So that, and then that's a separate problem itself. I must say that I kind of reviewed about 1,000 transplants during my Toronto year, and then maybe some more here, maybe around 25 now. We've not seen many PA PV problems. Like when I specifically asked the surgeons there, so they like the PA problems would be mostly visible intra-op, like if your PA is long and torsion is a problem, then it's all hemodynamic. It would be pretty obvious intra-op. Pulmonary vein, kind of, I've read a lot of case reports like venous infarction, unilateral kind of, especially with unilateral, then you think of the PV issue again, not seen any. I didn't, the other point I wanted to, I think it probably people might misunderstand from your talk, like you presented it very well about the prophylaxis. So CMV prophylaxis in lung, there is no question, it's universal prophylaxis for everyone. So except the ones that are D minus, R minus, so they get acyclovir prophylaxis. The other three groups based on the IgG, we generally prophylax for different durations. Now, how long would you prophylax is center specific. Generally, most centers that I know use 6 months for anything that is not a mismatch, and 9 months at least for something that is a mismatch. Now, some centers are doing 12 months for a mismatch, but again, that is based on one small RC. Now, again, all of this is prophylaxis, not treatment. So that is one thing I just wanted to clarify. Now, again, about antifungal prophylaxis, separate talk in itself. So again, like what you discussed, every center has its own. There is absolutely, there are more meta-analysis than there is data on to do meta-analysis. So then no one's the wiser. What I did observe is that a lot of the US centers tend to use inhaled ambisome. And then in Toronto, as such, they've done everything. The current protocol is based on, like, and then I was fortunate to talk with Dr. Sagar Jain, who's one of the, so he was, so that their current protocol is just preemptive. And then they use the donor galactomannan, donor explant pathology, donor fungal cultures, recipient bile, and so the set of all these 6 measurements to guide prophylaxis, and then they only prophylax if there is some indication based on this. And then they publish large series with excess of 400 patients showing that it's safe. Now, I kind of naively brought this protocol into India, and then we implemented this prophylaxis when patients were actually getting origonals. So now my prophylaxis is universal without it being intending to be universal. So I guess it's very specific to where you are, and then you should be evolving your own prophylaxis protocols. Then about the point about patients who are being listed already and then worsening, and then who are never listed but then are on ECMO for several months, going up for a transplant. Again, this is something which is like raises a lot of ethical considerations, like you very nicely pointed out. If I remember right, this was actually a pro-con debate in CHEST a couple of months ago, maybe close to a year now. And then, like the advantage here, the reason is that, like, if somebody's on ECMO for 3 months and then they are stable on ECMO with a single organ failure, now the survival without doing ECMO, without doing a transplant at that point is 0. Whereas even if you accept a reduced short-term survival, but probably equivalent long-term survival, say 75%, 80% 1 year and then onwards, that is an absolute mortality benefit of of 75%. So so this is something that probably is there to stay with us. So there will be a small subset, but these are less than 5% of our cohorts. So again, these are my small.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas. Before we start the talk, just a couple of general questions to Dr. Rupam. Ma'am, what is the one-year survival rate for lung transplant in your center or in UK in general? Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please. Sorry.
So I was asking a couple of general questions. What is the 1 year and 5 year survival rate at your center or in UK in general?
1 year survival, sorry, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'll have to just see it and let you know. Yeah.
And have you done any COVID transplants recently? COVID lungs?
No, we are in terms of evaluating a couple of patients, but not yet, not in UK.
And for the post ECMO transplants, are they any different from the other patients, you know, like emphysema, etc.?
So yeah, so before the patient goes on ECMO, it is if they are listed for transplant, they're usually they tend to be COPD or interstitial lung disease patients, which we have seen who eventually get transplanted because VV ECMO is easier and helps to support, and usually they can even get single lungs and they can come out of their bridging before transplantation. So mostly COPD and interstitial lung diseases.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Srinivas, sir, will start your talk. Dr. Ashutosh, any comments, sir? Or should we carry on the talk?
No, I think Srinivas can continue.
Thank you for having me here, Dr. Tapesh. And actually, when I saw Dr. Ashutosh was actually about to moderate my talk, I was planning to withdraw my talk. So, so I still remember sir's comments. So back to my student days now. So here I go. If I hope, okay. All right. So this is more of a kind of a talk of where we are and why we are here and is there a way forward. I try to be.
Please share your screen, Dr. Srinivas.
Oh yeah, sorry, I might have missed that. So is the screen visible now?
Yes, sir. Please carry on.
All right. So sorry about that. So this is more about where are we in the Indian context, and then is there a way forward? I'll try to be as much data driven as possible, but then the nature of the topic is that it's more of a philosophical discussion. So first of all, why bother about a cadaveric program in India when we actually have a huge problem in delivering kind of basic services now? And then a lot of the kinks in the system have been exposed by the pandemic that we are having, and also that more than 1 million people each year die from several treatable infectious disease. So why really bother about something that is so complex like a cadaveric lung transplant program? In this, actually, the easiest way to convey the need for this program is that this is similar in the medical field, like how the moon missions are, or the PSLV launches are for the ISRO. In the sense that we, even though that India is a land of divides, and then while we still have people dying from infectious disease, does not negate the fact that people are still dying of respiratory failure. So both still need therapy, and then we cannot wait for everyone to to stop dying of diarrheal diseases and pneumonia when we start transplanting. So that's simply not likely to, and then we would have lost so many people, and that's ethically probably not right. So and also there, just like how the ISRO missions have led to this digital revolution and on the smartphone revolution in India, and then pushed us into several decades ahead. Similarly, a transplant program has the several runoff effects which can help deliver better intensive care, better immunological therapies, better etc. etc. So it's not just transplant per se. And then if you look at the causes of death in India, you can see clearly that COPD is among the top causes of death, which has actually changed position. So we have now a 22% increase in COPD as the cause of death as opposed to 2005 over the last 15 years. And this is still, mind you, 2016 data. And I suspect, now there's a separate category there called COVID, which is again respiratory. So, so this is again another strong reason in that we have, in terms of absolute numbers, close to about more than 750,000 people dying every year from chronic respiratory disease alone, indicating that a large proportion of these patients are probably eligible.
Dr. Srinivas, can you just come closer to the mic, sir? The voice is a little. Can just come closer.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I hope I'm better audible now.
Yes,
Is that okay?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, indicating that a large proportion of our of these patients, close to a quarter or 750,000, are probably eligible transplant candidates. So a lot of these deaths are probably preventable. So briefly, what about the structure of the cadaveric transplant program in India, which we should know, talk about how things are. So at the bottom level, there are individual hospitals which are affiliated to the state level bodies. And then there are several NGOs which are coordinating with these hospitals. Broadly, these are the 6 kind of big organizations in state level organizations, which are state level transplant organizations called SOTOs in India. Transplant in Tamil Nadu has been historically the most active organization, but then Jeevandan in Andhra and then in Mumbai, as well as the Zonal Coordination Center, have been doing more work of late. Now, these are then coordinated by the regional transplant, at least in the framework, centers, and then the nodal centers, of course, NOTO in New Delhi. Now, if you look at organ transplant in India, India is actually the 3rd largest organ transplant country by volumes. We do in excess of about 12,000 transplants a year. But if you look at the data, most of it, that is 95% of it, is actually living, which is a paradox in this. And this is an old editorial in the sense that we are, when India was actually number 2 over China, when China subsequently now overtaken India, that India is the world's number 2 transplant, but then most of it is living donor, which itself has its own implications in the sense that you're placing a lot of morbidities. We know that now donating a kidney is not free from risk, especially long term. So, and then live lung is extremely complex and something that's not likely to take off at all. So it's imperative in this background to look at where our current situation is and what are our prospects. So if you look at data from, if you look at data from NOTO, which is the National Coordinating Body for organ, this is the data in 2018. NOTO does not display data for 2019 and understandably not for 2020. So you can clearly see that well in excess of about 10,000 transplants have occurred. And on an average year, roughly around 8,000 kidney transplants, almost all live occur. And about 2,500 liver transplants occur across the country. But you can see the data from 2018, there are about 241 heart transplants and then 191 lung have been reported. Now you should actually realize that these are data, and these data have been increasing over time, irrespective of the organ that you're talking about. But it's important to realize that this is actually not the number of transplants. This is actually the number of organs retrieved. So a quick background check clearly shows that actually in the year 2018, the number of transplants were conservatively around 85, not more than 85. So yielding less than 1 in 2 actually being transplanted, meaning that there is still significant organ wastage at this point. So this is something that's to be audited, but NOTO does not audit transplant outcomes yet. So if you look at where our transplant programs are, the program actually started in Tamil Nadu and then really took off in 2014 onwards. So in 2018, they had somewhere close to about 70 transplants overall, heart and lung, but dual lung only 51 per se happening. And then subsequently in 2020 to 21, one center migrated to Telangana. So they now have 3 centers, with only one being actually very active. So they did 50 last year, and they tell me they've done 20 this year. Telangana is now did not have an active program before 2020 April, And they had done historically 5 heart lungs, including 1 bilateral lung in total till 2020 in one center. In April 2021, center actually started, the center from Global Chennai moved to Telangana, and then they started, they tell me they've done 50 over the last 8 months. And then we are other center, we've done about 11 over the last 16 weeks. So this is the actual transplant activity. So if you look at the transplant activity per million patients, you can clearly see that India is actually way below than several countries. And then if you look at the, we are somewhere actually above Ecuador and below Bulgaria in terms of per million population, even though our absolute numbers are not terrible. So if you look at the history of lung transplant worldwide, the first successful lung transplant was actually done in Toronto in '83. And then first bilateral lung transplant was done in Toronto again in '86 for CF. Very interestingly, both of these patients by themselves long-term survivors. The '83 patient actually survived for 6.5 years. Unfortunately, actually died due to a hemorrhage due to a transbronchial lung biopsy, which was surveillance biopsy. The BLT patient in '86 actually survived 15 years after his transplant. So indicating that actually even then, careful selection of patients is the most important outcome, and then you can expect long-term survivors after lung transplant, provided you take care of your patients. These are the other kind of landmarks in lung transplantation. And then you can see by 2020, we've had well in excess of 60,000 transplants, which have done overall. There are about 4,500 reported to ISHLT, but if you look at Global Observatory, they report excess of 6,000 transplants a year lung-wise. So this is something that Dr. Rupam has actually shared with us from ISHLT, just making the point again that I wanted to make. In terms of lung transplant in India, if you look, we've been late to the game, more than I would say 3 decades now. So the Transplantation of Human Act actually was first actually passed in 1994, but was actually in abeyance till 93 because of kidney racket going on in West Bengal. So it actually started in force somewhere in 98, 99. Around this time, few hospitals per se in Chennai were actually doing individual transplants in their centers. Now, Mohan Foundation is an NGO which was early, which got into this quite early. They coordinated with 6 hospitals in late 1999 to establish the network in Chennai, which started doing cadaveric organ, some sort of allocation between these 6 hospitals itself. And the first heart lung transplantation in India was done in '99 by Dr. Cherian in Chennai again, Frontier Lifeline. So subsequently, you can see that there were a lot of issues still about the Transplantation Human Organ Act. It became Tissue and Organ Amendment Act. The amendment was passed in 2011 and became a law in 2014. Tamil Nadu was actually in the meanwhile doing transplants by a series of government orders, codified all of the government orders, and then made organization which started working called Transplant in 2015. So if you say that actually the history of lung transplant in India is actually only 5 years. So it's too early to say that the programs have not taken off, because hardly any activity before 2015 itself. You can see actually the first single lung transplants were actually done 2012 by Dr. Jnanish Thakkar, who is a very good friend of mine, and I'm really proud to be associated with him. And then he himself again did the first bilateral lung transplant in August 2013 in Frontier Lifeline. You can see that Noto was actually first as a body became active in 2012, but didn't do anything till 2015. Really became active only in 2018. You can see again, like there are 3 centers which have been doing some sort of small work till 2017, when the program at Chennai actually started becoming quite active, doing about 55 to 60 per year. So 2017 onwards till now, they've done close to about 132 transplants. The program at MGM Chennai is predominantly heart transplant program, started doing lungs as well. They reported having done about 30 transplants till date, most of them BLTs. Dr. Paul Ramesh's team at Apollo Chennai again reported about 30 BLTs till date. And then we've reported about 8 BLTs in the last 16 weeks. So in total, you can see about less than 350 transplants till date in India, and the annual somewhere stands around less than 100 per year now. And then if you look at what are these transplants for, look at 132 transplants, you can see that well in excess of 65% is for interstitial lung disease, with the others trailing far behind. Very interestingly, bronchiectasis, for which you'd actually be pressed to find data abroad, is actually about 10% of our transplants. So indicating that our data is likely to be very interesting and different from the rest of the world, and needs to be published. So if you we now look at the organ scenario, what is the current scenario and prospects? We next go to what are the challenges in our why is this programs, or what is the perception, why have these programs not taken up? So the first challenge I'd like to point out is the organ donation rate, and the perception of brain death and controversies and its effects. So in terms of organ donation in India, per million population, we have one of the lowest organ donations in the world. And it's at a decimal 0.3 per million, PMP per million population in 2019. Now, within this, there are huge differences in the sense that Tamil Nadu has 6 times the national average, the city of Chennai having a very high donation rate, albeit that has fallen off recently. Chandigarh reported in 2014 having a donation of 6.5 billion, with PGI itself accounting to about 35 in that year. But overall, population-wise, less than 0.01% donate. And several reasons have been pointed out, mainly awareness, literacy, religious and superstitious beliefs, and a lack of legislation in several parts of the country. Some people, especially in INSHLT conferences, have suggested actually India should have an opt-out policy. Now, if you compare opt-out is you're presumed to donate, you said not, no otherwise. Like Spain, for example, has an opt-out policy, and it has one of the highest donations, 35.3 per million population. But it's a kind of it does donations don't naturally follow an opt-out policy. When systems that have an opt-in and opt-out have been compared, what has been evident is that there is definitely an association with decreased disease with live donation programs, but there is no significant increase in the disease donor program. It's been almost the same statistically. So even if you have an opt-out policy, you need to address barriers to organ donation, and that has to occur systematically in terms of legislation, in terms of non-governmental organization, in terms of governmental support, and in terms of champions in the community who need to keep at it regularly, because it's something that needs to be an ongoing activity. So if you look at overall donations from different states, Tamil Nadu has reported about 1,500 donations till date, most of them again from after 2015, with about 1 in 3, actually more than 1 in 3, giving a lung donors, fairly respectable numbers. If you look at Mumbai, 24 of their 139 donations, 24 of their 900 donations have actually only donated the lung. There have actually been more heart donations than lung, which itself means that there is some issue that needs to be sorted out there. Again, Andhra and the Telangana twin states were a little later to the game, but then the numbers have been increasing. Last year, they reported about 69 lungs that have been donated. Rajasthan reported about 4, I think, donated. Again, these were flown into Chennai, as far as I know. So there are several controversies that keep happening with cadaveric donation, with live donation, and often. So one big controversy has been foreigners getting and transplant tourism. So if you look at kidney, almost there are no foreigners getting a kidney cadaveric donation in India. So almost all the cadaveric kidney donations are taken by Indians. However, 20 to 25% of foreigners were getting heart or lung transplants in India, and this was actually only in the state of Tamil Nadu, which is the only one doing these transplants till last year. So this has been quite an area of concern. It's been raised in media. It's been raised in our press as well, in medical journals as well. So TransTan woke up to this, and then they passed kind of stringent laws in the sense that when you now take a consent, you need to specify that the next of kin is aware of that this could potentially go to a foreigner, and then they should consent for that. So that is one part of the consent process, which is additional. And then they've also limited the number of donations that can actually go to foreigners in terms of priority. Now it is Indians in the state, Indians in other states, and then foreigners if there are no takers in the entire country. And still that should be less than 25% of the, so 1 in 4 is only allowed. So if you look at the fallout of that is that overall this has added complexity, this perception of this not being pure, or something in the system that is not seemingly well, has led to a consistent drop in the donations in Tamil Nadu over time. You can see from a peak of 185, donations have actually dropped in 2019, well before COVID, to 128, even though this remained the #1 state in the country. Again, this was actually not helped by another prominent case that happened in 2018 when a patient who was from Kerala was not considered properly. There were a lot of misconceptions possibly related to language, and then that definitely there was some wrong allocation of organ to a foreign patient here, which was some bribery possibly involved in that, and that led to a hiatus in the program for a while. So these definitely this is another issue. Transplant programs and the organizations coordinating them have to be whiter than white, with equitable access to the population that is serving them. And then this is very important. For example, in Kerala, a senior doctor for some reason has taken it into his mind that the brain death declaration as currently practiced and exploited worldwide is not correct. So he's put a bill in the Supreme Court, and that case is still ongoing. That Kerala has somehow been unnecessarily killing patients who are brain dead for harvesting organs. So this kind of led to movies being taken where brain dead victims were being created, victimized, and that became a huge hit runaway, I'm told, in Kerala. That kind of has dropped the donations from 72 in 2015 to about 8 in 2018. So that is something that again should be looked at. So this is again a fallout of what I described. If you look at the absolute numbers, they have been falling in Tamil Nadu from a peak of 185. But if you look at the percentage of lungs that have been harvested, that they remain fairly well in excess of 55%, indicating a very good utilization rate, which is almost among the top in the world. So next other issue is, what about donor lung quality? Is donor lung quality an issue that our programs have not taken off? This study from PGI clearly indicates that that's not the case. Their retrospective review of 55 patients found that actually, even though ideal donors are only 1 in 3, they could still utilize more than 65% of donations in their series of 55 patients, even though they were able to do 1 transplant in the period, indicating at this point, demand-supply ratio is not the problem. The problem is inadequate utilization of available organs. Even the same data from our, we looked at our donations, 35 donations over a period of 16 weeks. Clearly, we've not had so many transplants. In our series, again, ideal donors were 35% and extended donors were actually 85%. So we could potentially use 5 out of 6 of these donors. Most of these were extended due to, PF ratios or otherwise, which were better after recruitment during sternotomy. We only did 8 VLTs, and then indicate the PGD rates were comparable to isogenic figures, and these patients, the recipients were quite sick, clearly associated with PGD in these patients. The most common reason for not using lungs was that we didn't have a matching recipient, not the fact that, so still demand supply ratios are not the problem here. If you look at utilization, only 4 out of the 27 other unused lungs were actually utilized by the state organ pool or the country organ pool. The rest, there were no takers. So indicating there are systematic factors in terms of not utilizing these organs. The next issue is recipient numbers, specifically the numbers, timing, and physician awareness. So if you look at the numbers, this is one thing that is I'm using. Lancet published figures in 2019, estimated more than 750,000 patients with chronic lung disease. If you estimate even that 1% of these patients are eligible for a lung transplant, you should annually be having 8,000 transplants, which is definitely more than 5,000 that US, for example, has estimated. So because we have 3 times their population. So, but the current penetration is actually 0.01% of this eligible population. So, assuming that a minimum transplant program size of 50 is needed, we need at least 4 programs per state to cater to a load of 8,000 transplants annually. So, at the current juncture, there are just 3 mid-sized programs and they are doing less than 100 for the entire country, clearly indicating that the issue, the bottleneck, is the programs themselves. So when we looked at our prospective data over a period, sorry. So this is again PGI data. PGI looked at their data about patients being referred for lung transplant, about what is the perception of patients and all. So in their series, 46.7% were actually patients with ILD, and then they had 1 in 4 COPD, which reflects the kind of the patients that come to their center. If you looked at the median survival of those patients who could potentially be listed, it was less than 3 months for patients with IPF, indicating that these patients were actually coming quite late for a transplant evaluation. And then very interestingly, those who said that they wanted transplant were actually quicker to die, indicating that the ones only the patients who are about to die actually realized the severity of the lung disease. So there is clearly a difference in the issue with the physician perception and informing patients that the disease is quite advanced, and then this is an option for them. And also a perception among patients that this is something that is potentially viable for them. So these two are probably issues. And again, if you look at our own data over the last 4 months, we looked at 224 patients that were referred for lung transplant and completed a transplant evaluation. Very interestingly, 1 in 3 was actually referred for COVID ARDS. 43% was actually referred for ILD. The mean age of this population was around 51 years. At onset, 65% actually had a obvious contraindication, and most of it was because of the COVID patients who are actually physically inactive or had an active infection or were too late, that kind of thing. Virtually 3 out of 4 did not have a PFT at referral. And if you look at just within the next couple of days, 10% had already died, indicating how late these transplant referrals were. And if you look at the data over follow-up, median of 90 days follow-up, 1 in 3 had actually again died, indicating that these patients were quite late in the referral. And then those who did not die, again, a few declined, like quite a sizable proportion declined for their evaluation, and less than 10%, I think, 13.4 were actually waitlisted, of which 8 were transplanted in our center and another 4 were transplanted in another center. 4 died in the waiting list, and then 50 are actually awaiting transplant, and another 3 are being bridged now. So another peculiar thing about transplant in India is that 65% are those for interstitial lung disease. Of the interstitial lung disease, less than 1 in 4 is actually for IPF, and then the vast majority is for progressive fibrosing ILDs. For PF-ILDs, the indication or the natural history is only now being defined. So the popular perception among senior pulmonologists in India is that patients on oxygen continue to live forever on oxygen, and then they don't worsen, and then transplant somehow kills them in a year. So this is another prominent referral for late referral. As I clearly indicated, 3 out of 4 don't have a PFT in the last year. So these patients are not getting enough PFTs, definitely. So it's difficult to define the natural history. So while there may be a subset of patients who will continue to be stable on oxygen, the vast majority of people, especially with ILD, tend to worsen over time. So it's important to catch these patients early and then refer them early for a transplant. There are also system issues in terms of legislation gaps, donation, funding, and state capacity. For example, only the states marked in blue actually have some sort of legislation for transplant. The rest of India actually has no legislation for a cadaveric program at all. And then funding wise is almost always borne by the patient, as in almost everything in India. There is increasingly, this typically costs about 35 lakhs in the current juncture. We are able to do it for 25 lakhs with around 10 lakhs being in form of a grant that we have with an NGO. But even though this is about 1/10 to 1/20th of a US cost, this is still a sizable amount for Indian patients. There is also the problem of medication costs, which costs about 20,000 for the first 6 months, mainly because of valganciclovir, which costs around 12,000 itself, and another 8,000 monthly. So this costs typically 5 lakhs for the first 2 years and 50,000 annually thereafter. So alternative reimbursement models are definitely needed in India. There is some beginning in this. For example, private insurance is now covering transplant per se, with some 3 months medication after the transplant, taking off a huge burden. The Tamil Nadu government, for example, has floated a 20 lakh coverage for lung and heart transplant. This covers 2 years of medications as well. So as far as I know, no transplants have been done under this scheme so far, even though a couple of hospitals have been licensed for this. Several heart transplants, though, have been done with this model. We've done 2 transplants with police insurance and work insurance so far out of our 8 patients, and that has worked very well, especially in terms of medications post-transplant follow-up. There is also a problem of lack of internal medicine training in terms of pulmonology training. So most pulmonologists directly do pulmonary medicine after their MBBS, so they do not have a very good exposure to internal medicine. Now, why this is a problem? Because transplant pulmonology is actually a step back. Transplant pulmonology is a misnomer. It should be labeled transplant internal medicine, I suspect, because most of transplant pulmonary medicine is actually internal medicine. There is hardly any pulmonology left. So it's mostly like infectious disease, critical care, and toxicology and everything put together. A good internal medicine training is crucial for transplant pulmonary practice. A good ID exposure and ID physician colleague is important. It's very good to have a good ICU experience with ECLS, which are all important to gauge who's likely to be a good patient, who's likely to have a heightened need for support during the transplant process, etc. And of course, there is also a problem of lack of formal medical or surgical transplant training in India, and almost no transplant immunology training in India. Another problem is that even though there are statewide bodies, they don't coordinate anything. They only tell you where the transplants are. They don't give you information that this is the patient, this patient's CMV is this patient's HLA is this, and this patient's whatever is this. This is their cultures, nothing. All that you get to know is that this is a patient, this is the age. You'd be surprised if you get the PF ratios per se or the X-ray per se, and then you'd be surprised if you get the retrieval time, correctly. Often we land up just like half an hour before the retrieval time, and then you're forced to assess the patient there, and then say that this is too late for us. So this is a problem, and this is a problem especially if it occurs at the national level. For example, Noto has about 150 crore budget annually, but I am yet to see how they've actually used this budget in terms of equitable supply of organs. For example, even organs donated in Chandigarh, which has a very good donation rate, have not been utilized, for example, in Delhi. So I suspect Noto's budget has not been utilized towards this aspect. Patients, especially in the rest of the country, have to pay for their organ retrieval, which costs about 5 to 7 lakhs on top of the transplant cost if it comes from outside the state. So that is again a big problem. And then I see one of the biggest problem in terms of transparency and of data is that Noto does not follow data of patients transplanted. It only follows data of donated. And though I suspect this is changing, they are now directly calling hospitals and then finding out what is happening. But we still need more data from all transplant centers to be more transparent, to be submitted to their respective transplant bodies, indicating what is the survival 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And we need champions, people who have survived these years, to go to the community, for community to realize that this is something that is good for them. This is something that is possible for them as such. Another important thing is sensitized patients. We, because of the ILD issue, we have 1 in 2 of, or at least I would say 2 out of 3 ILD patients are actually women that we see. So a lot of them are actually because of pregnancy or are sensitized. So we have quite a lot of sensitized patients, and then there is a lot of HLA heterogeneity in India. We don't have data on HLA distribution statewide or region-wise in any big number in India. So we don't have something called calculated PRA. Most organizations still use the outdated PRA percentage, which means nothing these days. So we need more data on single antigen beat. What is the calculated PRA with reference to your population, which is the donor population? And then we found that actually then our SAP panel does not include several of the HLAs that we see commonly in our population. So a lot of these issues which will arise, and then which we have to give our unique solutions. So so early days still. This is something that has recently come up in the last 1 month. The Jeevan Labs in Chennai has actually now made their online calculator, CPRI calculator. Again, this is based on their data in Chennai. So I'm not sure how eligible this is for, say, Delhi, but that's something that we need to look at in close. So the other things are, of course, patients' perceptions and the cost, and then COVID is now kind of amplified the problem. Good in some way, in the sense that now patients are aware that there are 2 organs called lungs in the body. The Chatiki doctor always used to be a cardiologist. Now it's also a pulmonologist. So that's good in a way. But what's bad in a way is that people think that transplant is an option for every patient with COVID, so that's bad. And then we spend a lot of time daily saying that it's too early, it's too late to a lot of patients, which is quite depressing. Again, like as has been pointed out, we don't know about several issues about bridging and outcomes for these patients. So clearly, this COVID transplants are not ready for prime time, at least in India, where you should actually have bridging programs when your transplant volumes are in excess of 100 per center. And if your transplant, typically 5% of your transplant should be bridged, not more than that. If your center is doing more than that, it indicates you're taking way more high-risk patients. Your outcomes are likely to be inferior, and it's too early for most centers. Clearly, it's also too early for my center, but that's something that we have to live with in the corporate world, I guess. So, in summary, I have a case that even like Rupam pointed out a patient that went wrong. And similarly, this is a patient with silicosis and respiratory failure, quite young, 35 years, not too terrible, last of 31, not sensitized, vaccinated. He got the first dose of ivermectin, very quickly got a donor and underwent a transplant, bilateral. Donor had contusions. Apart from that, nothing else. Bronchoscopy was pristine. Very interestingly, day 3, we actually isolated PDR Klebsiella, which was NDM and OXA48. So patient was treated with Zarcepta and Astrenum. The Captomanin was reported by day 4 as 5. Fungal smears were negative and fungal cultures continued to be negative. So, like I said, we gave preemptive worry. But what actually happened with this kind of combination was that this patient developed airway ischemia and a 20-degree dehiscence. So, ended up getting a stent bilaterally on day 35. Had non-resolving consolidation in the lingula, which actually turned out to be pulmonary strongyloidosis. So even though this patient did get 1 dose of ivermectin, developed strongyloidosis, possibly did not develop disseminated strongyloidosis because of 1 dose of ivermectin before. That kind of resolved with the regimen of ivermectin followed by serial bronchoscopic valve lavages for clearance. Along with this strongyloidosis, this patient again developed PDR. After the 2 weeks of therapy, we stopped the BAL treatment. We typically give for 14 days. Once that was stopped, and a couple of days, they said there was a new effusion, and we again isolated the same PDR Klebsiella in the pleural fluid. Fortunately, the fluid was not very turbid. Glucose was well in excess of 80. So we drained it quickly, and now slowly this patient is better by 3rd month, and bilateral stents have been removed. He does have a residual right middle lobe stenosis, but FEV1 is a respectable 2 liters. And is ambulant off oxygen, thinking about resuming his job. So we do have small successes. So in summary, I suspect that we are quite early in thoracic transplantation in India. The main limiting factor is the dearth of good teams and inability of corporate programs to invest in this endeavor. A team should ideally have a transplant pulmonologist, at least 2 thoracic surgeons, one of whom is senior, one of whom is doing retrieval, 2 cardiac anesthetists. They should be lobbying government for support, donation, and awareness. A 1,000-bedded hospital with a large thoracic caseload and access to good intensive care unit, OT, and a good supply of dedicated nurses, perfusionists, rehabilitation specialists, social workers, coordinators, transplant nutrition counselors, ancillary medical specialties and surgical specialties is ideal. And programs can offset the cost by several revenue models. And this does have several direct as well as indirect benefits with the financial independence definitely by 2 years. Thank you.
Can you stop your share screen, sir?
Yeah, I've stopped it.
Yeah, Ashutosh, can you come on, please? Sir, Dr. Ashutosh. Right.
Yeah, Srinivas, that was a fantastic talk. I mean, I have never seen so much about the Indian scenario in a single presentation. So it was quite nice. And I would just like to add some of our own perspective. That perspective might be slightly different from the corporate perspective. The peculiar problems that we face in the government sector are primarily related to cost. Like you mentioned that your center is able to at least tell the patient that it will cost about 35 lakhs. I know that several other centers in Chennai, for instance, quote a starting price of about 45 lakhs plus. We offer our patients a price of only about 15 lakhs. And yet in our setup, most patients will say no. That's the irony of the whole situation. Whereas in the corporate sector, people are willing to say yes to a cost of 35 to 45 lakhs upfront, which will balloon out to more than that, because I have had a couple of patients whom this promised 45 lakhs actually got escalated to 75 lakhs plus because of some complications which are inevitable. I'm not saying that it is the hospital's fault, but what I'm trying to say is that the price that you quote will invariably get inflated as the patient recovers. So obviously this kind of cost cannot be borne by a very large state of our society, and therefore a lot of our patients, just because they cannot afford the transplant, do not get this opportunity. The second thing that we have found is that most of these patients have unrealistic expectations. When they get referred to us, most of the times their treating doctor has told them that your lungs are bad, you get a transplant and they will become new. For the patient, new means that these new lungs will last a lifetime. And when we tell them that even at the best of centers, the 5-year survival is say 50 to 60%, they are shocked. They said that, okay, we were not told this. And then they start weighing their options, and more often than not, they will prefer to have a poor quality of life with the existing lung disease rather than pay a certain amount with the uncertainty that in 5 years, 50% of them will die. So I think at point of referral itself, I think it's the treating physician's duty to at least inform the patient that it is not a panacea. It has its own set of problems. And although the quality of life may improve, the longevity will improve, but not for all patients. So for the vast majority, it would be a better option, but patients should be told about that. As you said, you quoted our papers also. Late referral is definitely a big problem for us. Most of the patients, by the time they reach us, have so many other issues that they become poor risk, and it is difficult to really convince ourselves also that they will be the good candidates for a transplant, especially when our own transplant program has not yet really taken off. I mean, one would be willing to accept high risk patients if, say, one has 50 or 100 transplants in their kitty. But if you have less than 10, for instance, then obviously you would like to choose patients who can give you a better outcome. Let your surgeons, let your physicians drive on that learning curve and gain some experience before you start taking up the more complicated patients. The other peculiar problem that we face is the problem of distance. So most patients who get referred to us are not from the city. They are from distant areas. And the simple calculation that we do for them is that if you can drive down to PGI in less than 5 hours, I mean, you can get a phone call at, say, 12 in the midnight, please reach Chandigarh by 6 a.m. in the morning. Is the patient able to do that? Because obviously, if we have to consider the ischemia time and everything. Most patients will say no to that. In the corporate sector, it is slightly easier. I have known, we have ourselves referred patients to Chennai for lung transplant, and the whole family just literally shifts to Chennai. So they'll rent an apartment there. They will stay there for 3 months, 6 months. By that time, hopefully they will get some suitable donor and they'll get transplanted. Things don't work out in the government sector like that, because we have a different clientele of patients, which is quite kind of different from what the corporate sector does. A lot of times finance, the lack of finance also manifests in several other ways. For instance, patients come to us and you see them and it's obvious they've not had a bath for weeks. How do you convince them that after transplant, their whole lifestyle has to change? Hygiene is such a big issue because we are going to give them immunosuppression. And so very often you, on the face of it, you know that these patients are very, very high risk candidates. So we are not really able to convince a lot of patients to be on our list. Our list is typically small, and because we are not able to arrange donors, or the patients themselves are not able to arrange finances, a lot of times they voluntarily drop off the list. So some of our patients, so we call them generally for a 6-monthly follow-up to repeat all their investigations and do their physiological testing and everything. A lot of times they will say that, okay, for some reason or the other, they want to temporarily put things on hold. And it may be a daughter's marriage or some finances needed for the kids' education and stuff like that. Very, very important issues in life, but somehow the preference for the lung is the priority is slightly lower down. So these things keep on happening, and unfortunately, that's the way to go. I will completely agree with you that we are very, very small in numbers as far as the total requirement is concerned. As you have calculated that probably we need more than one transplant center in every district. So we are still a very far way to go from there. For our own data, we realize that about 30% of our lungs will meet the standard criteria for eligibility, and another about 30% will meet the extended criteria, which is, I think, quite similar to what your own experience that you projected is. The problem is that we did this as an academic exercise, just to know that what is the kind of clientele that we are getting amongst the donors. But sadly, most of these lungs, even if we feel that they are fit, are not harvested.
Right.
Just because we have an extensive organ sharing network. So some of our, I think only 1 or 2 times we have been able to explant lungs and send them outside Chandigarh for transplant to nearby cities in like Delhi and all. And fortunately, our administration is quite helpful in that they create full green corridors for us from PGI to the airport, and it takes probably about 15 minutes of drive time, which is incredible given the traffic that we have. So we have a lot of support from the administration, but even then, sadly, the things don't materialize. So I think we are still in infancy, and it will continue to be there. Patients come to our OPD and they ask, we find that they are extremely fit, and so, and they ask us one simple question: sir, how many transplants has the center done? So we truthfully tell them, boss, we have done only 1 transplant. That patient also died, and then they vanish. They don't go to Chennai or Hyderabad or such places. I mean, the fact that we had just 1 case, a premier institute like us, and we simply are not able to generate enough interest amongst the potential recipients regarding the whole exercise. A lot of them are very happy staying on long-term oxygen therapy at home, pulling along with their some little course, household chores, and really not bothered about the full potential that their lungs can give. And they are happy with that. That is the unfortunate scenario with us. Just trying to add something to the stuff that you already mentioned. And of course, the problems that you have listed, both administrative and clinical, also equally apply to our kind of setup. Thanks.
I totally agree with everything you said, sir. But even if you say that a small proportion of the population who are on oxygen, even if they are eligible, there is a whole lot of patients who need to be transplanted. The fact that the patients, clearly there are patients who are going to be worsening every year. 1 exacerbation is enough to land these patients on. Like I myself know, for example, a couple of weeks ago, a very prominent person who was in the state metallurgical society, very learned person himself, now in his 68. So he had a just exposure-related ILD that's been diagnosed since 2000. Now, so he did not have any serial monitoring of his PFTs, as in most of the people. The pulmonologist that the last PFT that I ever saw was in 2010, I think, and then fallen off the grid. Now he had 1 exacerbation requiring oxygen in 2018. Again, no one told him about transplant. Now the second exacerbation in 2021 landed on the ventilator. Now they want to know about transplant. Clearly, this is not somebody who you want to be listing or at 68 bridging without consent before. So this is something that's happened to somebody who's a well-read person. So clearly, it's happening to several people.
Yeah, so now we make a conscious effort that these patients should at least be referred for transplant workup. referral does not necessarily mean listing. So, so if unless you refer patients in time, they're not going to be listed in time. That is the simple maths.
Dr. Gyanesh, who did the first transplants in India, is actually on this. I actually invited him so that he can give us his, he can hear straight from the horse's mouth. So he's actually put his hands up. I invite Dr. Gyanesh to actually give a couple of comments. Sir?
Sir, please come on. Please put your video on and come on, sir.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Srini. Your presentation was absolutely fascinating. The amount of data and the amount of hard work that you've done is phenomenal. I really appreciate and congratulate you for that. For my suggestion was
Sir,
based
can you put your
on.
video on? Everybody can see you. Can you please have your video on? Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
So my suggestion was for doing in PGI Chandigarh. If you look at how the cardiopulmonary bypass and surgery began, heart-lung, what Dr. Kirkland did, who established the cardiopulmonary bypass historically in the world, what he did was he took 20 patients and he decided to do free these 20 patients. So even if you take 2 or 3 patients and if you operate them at Chandigarh and they are walking and they are alive, then this will motivate other people. So you can get past this obstruction of that we don't have a single patient walking. We operated on 1 patient and that too he has died. This is one suggestion, that you operate 3 or 5 patients free of charge and you have a living patients post-operative. Of course, lung transplantation is a lot of post-operative care and a lot of hard work. My other suggestion was that in Pittsburgh, which is a small tier 2 city like Coimbatore or Pune, it is not a place where there is a lot of crime. Yet it was the largest program in the world for more than 5 years. The reason was that we have a family house over there, and we did a lot of organs procurement from far off places which were rejected by other programs. So there are 5 family houses which are there in the city. So people from Los Angeles, from New York, from various parts of the world, from United States, would come over there and stay over there. The family house belongs to the university. This is one suggestion that we can look into for people to come from far off places to have nice family houses, where the family houses where each one has a separate bedroom. Each family has a separate bedroom, but they have a common area, which is a drawing room, a kitchen. They have separate refrigerators and they can live in that. They have a computer room and entertainment room for TV and all. So that's a family house. That was one suggestion. In Bombay, when we did the initial early transplants, there was one girl who needed a transplant. She was very poor. There are 250 trusts in Bombay. So we could easily collect the money. And there is a Tata Trust, which always is very generous and gives lots of money to all these patients for any definitive surgery. So there was this patient. I went to their house. She was coming from a Jhopadpatti in Bhiwandi. If you have to send this patient, as was pointed out by Dr. Ashutosh, that if you send the patient back to that area which is not having adequate fresh air, cleanliness, and electricity and clean water, it is that their 1 year survival is going to be not acceptable. So my suggestion is that the government should, for these poor patients, have what I call as a transplant township, which provides them with the basic cleanliness, air, clean water, and electricity. These are a few of my thoughts.
Yeah, these are well taken, Dr. Gyanesh. And just to tell you that the only transplant that we did was completely free of cost. The institute bore the entire expense for that transplant, including the surgical and the post-operative care, all medicines and everything. So that is something that we are quite willing to do. Maybe we'll not be able to do it for all patients once the numbers increase, but definitely on a case-by-case basis, it can be done. The family house, as you said, is a very interesting concept. I myself was at Pittsburgh for some short-term training, and I stayed in that family house. And
Fantastic.
in the evening, as you said, we could see that in that common kitchen, there was one lady whom we would meet every day. She would walk into the kitchen with a oxygen concentrator, pulling oxygen concentrator, waiting for the transplant for last 3 months. But not getting listed because her condition, I think she had lymphangiomyomatosis, and she was saying that this is extremely a low priority for them to transplant, and she was in the family house for 3 months. But that kind of support, if one is able to gather, will definitely go a long way in improving the chances for some of these patients.
Just to
Yeah,
add
in
on to this,
UPMC,
Yes, Dr. Rupam, please tell us.
yes, so recently I had the experience that one of the CF patients, she was 21 years old. She was transplanted. She had a complex post-operative period, and her brother at home also had CF with resistant Burkholderia, and she had mold in her house. So the occupational and the social support have gotten her a separate 1-bedroom place near her house where she is going to stay separately from her family, but as close as she can be. So these kind of things really make the program very strong, and the patient's confidence increases that my priorities are being taken care of.
So I think any more comments from anybody, sir? Ganesh sir or Dr. Rajgopala sir or Ashutosh sir? Okay. Dr.
I just want to say thank you to Dr. Srinivas. It was an eye-opener presentation for me, especially I'm new to this field and I'm learning every day, and knowing about the Indian scenario and the struggles that are being faced, which are real, which I know, but I never had them in numbers in front of me. And seeing your enthusiasm and motivation is also a learning for us, that in spite of all these difficult situations, you guys are doing amazing work. We have everything put in front of us. It is just that we have to go attend the waiting list, outpatients, and everything gets done, and patient even gets a transplant over weekend. So I learned a lot. Thank you so much. And the presentation was amazing. And it's not an easy presentation to make, to be honest. Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Dr. Tapesh.
Thank you, Dr. Rupam Sejal, for a wonderful presentation. I think for all our intensivists, it was wonderful. Few of them would be working in lung transplant units, and in the coming years, they'll learn much from your lecture because that was what it is. And thanks to Dr. Srinivas for putting the Indian perspective of the struggle. And hopefully we shall get more and more lung transplants into the picture. Thank you, Ashutosh sir, for your PGI experience. We know your limitations, our limitations, coming from AIIMS, what kind of challenges we face and the kind of population we have. And thank you, Ganesh sir, for all your wisdom and all your wise words. Thank you, everybody. So we shall just close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.